We learned a lot from UFC 301, Alexandre Pantoja versus Steve Erceg, and this is going to be my top 3 takeaways from the card. I'm going to start with a couple honorable mentions, then I'm going to get into my actual list, ending with my biggest takeaway from UFC 301, and starting off with my first honorable mention, and that is that UFC 301 was massively underrated going into this fight card. I understand for $80, $85, it wasn't the greatest pay-per-view, but the prelims were just incredible. The main card, I think, delivered. The fights weren't super meaningful, but they were exciting nonetheless, and they were somewhat meaningful. But to go through this card, I'm not going to go through every fight, but Joe Anderson, Brito, Jack Shore, Miktabek Uralbai versus Elvis Brenner. Incredible prelims, incredible fights. Michel Pereira versus Iho Potieria. I feel like people were crapping on this card so badly, and even the main event, Pantoja versus Steve Erceg, really should have been fight of the night, in my opinion. That was an incredible fight. It was an incredible matchup. And I just feel like it's worth highlighting that I felt like UFC 301 was a massively underrated going into the card, that people weren't even excited for it at all. And I kind of understand. I'm not saying, there's anything wrong with that. But looking at how this card played out, it was a very entertaining card. Honestly, I'm looking through the fights right now. Was there any bad fights? I mean, maybe Barboza, Karakate. Basically, Barboza, Karakate. And maybe, the Carolina Kovacevic fight as well, which, wasn't great against Yasmin Lucindo. But overall, really good card, really solid card. I don't mind that I paid $85. There was people saying, I want my money back, and I didn't even pay for it. UFC 301 was worth it. If you didn't see the fight card, go back and watch the prelims. The prelims were really incredible, and I really enjoyed the prelims. And I really enjoyed this card just from top to bottom. Let's get into the next honorable mention, and that is, and I hate to say this, the UFC Brazil crowd absolutely sucks. At least 90% of it. Maybe there's a 10% of the crowd that's actually good. But, I mean, they didn't show up. And maybe that's because that could be partially to blame on the UFC because they priced the tickets too high. But it seems like every UFC event, even UFC 300, I mean, half the seats were empty until, like, the feature prelim, the main card, really. Honestly, half the seats were empty at UFC 300, let alone UFC 301. So maybe I don't know what's going on. But either way, the crowd's barely showing up. Then when the crowd finally does show up, they leave after Jose Aldo. Then the crowd that sticks around, maybe 50% of the crowd that's left for Pantoja versus Erceg, we get an absolute amazing matchup, amazing fight, competitive matchup, and the crowd then leaves while Pantoja's speaking on the mic. I'm just tired of it, man. Glover Teixeira retired to an empty arena. It's just the fan base there isn't as rabid as it once was. I remember the days of, Vitor Belfort and Anderson Silva and Jose Aldo. And I know Jose Aldo was on this card, but I remember those guys main eventing there, and the crowd was wild. And I'll never forget when Aldo knocked out Mendez with the knee and then ran into the crowd. And those days are over. Brazil doesn't care anymore. I guess they don't have their Brazilian star. Without Jose Aldo on this card, maybe nobody shows up at all. Maybe that's why Jose Aldo probably got a fat paycheck from the UFC. But the crowd is just, every single time, it's just abhorrent. So don't go there anymore, UFC. I feel sorry for the fans who do appreciate it, but just don't go there anymore. Moving up on my list, my next honorable mention, and that is that Steve Erceg and Miktabek Uralbai are legit. And I know I'm kind of throwing two fighters into the same honorable mention, but either way, Steve Erceg always looked good. He looked good in the few fights, David Dvorak and, Matt Schnell, and he looked good in those fights, but we hadn't seen him against the elite of the elite. And even though he lost in the main event, competitive fight against Alexandre Pantoja, who fights like a guy from a video game, who's an absolute savage, who's good everywhere. And Steve Erceg went out there and had a very competitive fight with him. I'm not into giving out participation trophies, like Colby Covington, and, his entire career is based on the fact that he got KO'd by Kamaru Usman and he was competitive before that and had a close fight with him in the rematch. But I think you got to give Steve Erceg credit. I mean, this is his fourth fight in the UFC, third fight in the UFC, and he's getting a title shot, ranked number 10, and goes out there and puts on a competitive performance against Alexandre Pantoja. I know a lot of us knew that Erceg had what it takes to potentially win, but I think now there were some questions going in this fight. Even though I thought Erceg, I even flirted with the idea of picking Erceg. After seeing that performance, we know he's a top-tier flyweight fighter, and he has a very bright future in the flyweight division. As far as Miktabek Uralbai, I know, the win against Elvis Brenner isn't like the biggest win or the biggest name. And I know he did gas in that third round. I think Uralbai is going to be a force to be reckoned in the 155-pound division. His grappling is unbelievable. He looks so strong. His striking looks really good. He has power on the feet. And, he can face adversity and still come back and win. He only has one loss on his record. I think this guy's going to be a threat. I mean, I would pick Uralbai right now. I'd pick him to ragdoll Jalen Turner and finish him. So I'm super high on Muktabek Uralbai, and I think he's legit as well. I'm not saying he's the elite of the elite. Like, we know Erceg is the elite of the elite, one of the elite of the elite. Uralbai, I just think I'm already, just from this fight card, I kind of already like the way he looked in his fight against Udo Šmedić. But now, after watching him at UFC 301, I can tell, okay, this is going to be a top 15 guy. I'm confident that Muktabek Uralbai will be a top 15 guy, even potentially a top 10 guy. I'll reevaluate as we see his next fight. But moving on to my next honorable mention, and this is one I hate to jump on this train, even though it's not really a train. Everyone's kind of on board. Anthony Smith is still delusional. We already knew he was delusional. He's still delusional. And I'm basing this off what the commentary team said that Anthony Smith said to them after he submitted Vitor Petrino. He said, "I may get gold just yet." I have no words for that. I do beat up Vitor Petrino. What was Vitor Petrino's best win? Off the top of my head, I can't even think right now. Anthony Smith thinks submitting him after getting beat up on the feet by him, after doing the spinneroonie against Khalil Roundtree in his last fight, after getting demolished by all the legit guys in the top of the light heavyweight division, he thinks Vitor Petrino with no fight IQ, who gets guillotined, who jumps into a guillotine while he's winning on the feet, proves that he may get a title. He may get some gold just yet. That's wild to me. That's crazy. I mean, maybe somehow Anthony Smith gets gifted a title shot. I would love to see him book it. I know I hate undeserved title shots. At this point, I would love the memes of Anthony Smith getting a title shot. And maybe he somehow pulls it off, but this dude's never even getting a title shot, let alone getting gold wrapped around his waist, unless it's some crazy short notice fight and somehow he gets it done against Pereira on the ground. Which, again, we're getting so many layers deep into that delusion. It's just Anthony Smith has taken far too much brain damage. Who knows what else he said after the fight, but Anthony Smith is completely delusional. Moving up on my list, let's move on to my actual list. Starting off with number 3. And that is that Jose Aldo is an absolute freak of nature. For Jose Aldo to come in at 37 years old and just outclass Jonathan Martinez, a top 15 guy who was on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fight winning streak after 2 years off from MMA. I know he wasn't off completely. He had some boxing matches or whatever. But to come in and put on that type of performance, he looks so good. And I want to, I want to add this context before I even say this, because some people they were annoyed that I said this in my post fight. But I love Jose Aldo. He's one of my favorite fighters of all time. He looks suspiciously good against Jonathan Martinez. His body looks suspicious. His speed looks suspicious. Jose Aldo, I think, is maybe just a freak of nature. But you can't help but notice this is the post-USADA era. But ultimately, Aldo proved that he's still one of the top bantamweights. At 37 years old, I want to see him thrown in there with a big fight. I would love to see Jose Aldo versus Davison Figueiredo. And if Jose Aldo wins that fight, let him fight the winner of O'Malley versus Merab. Aldo can have one last title run in him. Imagine Aldo getting a title shot. That'd be crazy. And for all he's done in the sport, the fact that he was on a decent streak before he lost to Merab, and then now he's come back and beat Jonathan Martinez after a 2-year layoff. Not 2-year layoff, but you get my point. 2 years from MMA, 2 years from the UFC. If he can beat another top contender, if he can beat Davison Figueiredo, which I know that's Brazilian versus Brazilian, but I would love to see that matchup. Throw him into a title shot. Would absolutely love to see that. It would be an incredible matchup. It would be incredible to see Jose Aldo, everyone keeps correcting me, see him fight for a title at 37, 38 years old. That'd be incredible. But overall, dude is just an absolute freak. The boxing looked crisp. The body shots look better than ever. The speed was, Jonathan Martinez looked like he saw a ghost out there. Because Jose Aldo was so fast. Jonathan Martinez was scared to let his hands go. At 37 years old, at 135, that's unheard of. Again, it's suspicious. It's suspicious. I'm not making any claims, but it's very, very suspicious. He looked that good. And I'm so happy that Aldo came back and got a win. I'm so happy that he could potentially be in title contention in the bantamweight division. But ultimately, I don't know if the UFC is going to re-sign him. He came back to fight out his deal. You know, he's a star in Brazil, but the UFC doesn't frequent Brazil that much where they absolutely need him. And I think Jose Aldo, I think, you know, he could go back into boxing if he liked those paydays. He wanted to finish out his UFC contract. Now he has potentially more options available to him outside the UFC now that he's out of his contract. So we'll see what happens. I would love to see him stick around and see if he's got one last title run in him. Jose Aldo looked incredible at UFC 301. Moving up on my list to number 2. And, you know, this one just hurts. This one honestly just hurts. And that is that the flyweight division will never be loved by MMA fans. And it comes down to one thing. And that is the fact that their brain can't, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? It just can't process the fact of enjoying fights of fighters who are smaller. That's it. Alexandre Pantoja is one of the most exciting fighters on the UFC roster. The flyweight division has filled out over the last, 4 or 5 years, really since Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson left. It has filled out quite a bit. We've had barn burner after barn burner. I mean, Figgy versus Moreno, 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, 2 was kind of a domination, but you get the point. You have all these incredible fights. Now you have Pantoja versus Erceg, and the fans still don't care. Nobody cared about this pay-per-view coming in. The fans in Brazil didn't care about the main event. It just seems like nobody cares. And the only thing that I can think of is it's just their size, their physical stature. They don't like how small they are. That's it. Because, I mean, I don't know. Pantoja's been getting a lot of hate lately saying, all he does is lay on guys. I've been seeing people say that, which is delusional. Dude fights like a video game character. Marches out, throws bombs, just starts clubbing dudes. Ragdolls guys and controls them on the ground and starts looking for submission and does decent ground and pound. And if a guy like Pantoja can't get respect, who in the division is going to get respect? And this division is really filling out. It has, great fighters and Brandon Moreno and Brandon Royval and Manel Kopp and, who else is coming up the ranks? I'm trying to think right now. Muhammad Makayev. I know that's not a great example considering his style isn't as fan-friendly. But it's just like this division can continue to get better and better and better, and the fans will just never love this division. They will never care about this division because of their size. Nobody cared about Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. Nobody cared. The UFC thought about getting rid of the division with him at the top of it. And luckily it's stuck around. We've gotten some incredible fights. It just sickens me. I don't know what we can do about it really. But if I can encourage anybody who's watching this video, start supporting the flyweight division. Start caring about the flyweight division. It's a great division. It's a fun division. I can't wait to see who Pantoja fights next. Potentially the winner of Makayev, if that ends up happening in Manchester. That could be a number 1 contender fight. Pantoja versus the winner there is an incredible matchup. Moreno, if he gets a win, he can get right back in the mix. Incredible matchup. I'd love to see them run it back. I know they've already fought, 3 times, including the Ultimate Fighter. But it just sucks. The fans, for whatever reason, just don't care about the flyweight division. And after last night, it's just, I always knew it, but it's just cemented that, that they just don't care because they're smaller. That's it. Fans were leaving the arena while we're getting a banger of a fight in the main event, and it just disgusts me, completely disgusts me. Moving on to my number 1 takeaway from UFC 301. And I mean, honestly, this is a takeaway from UFC 301 just because it's a major point of 301, but I kind of already had this. It's no matter what, fans will always cry robbery. And I'm so tired of hearing people say, there's so many people snobby, I know the criteria better than you know the criteria. And there's so many people pointing to certain YouTubers and saying, this YouTuber said this and he counted, and there's, medium and large and whatever it may be, strikes and this and that. And I'm just so tired of after every fight where you don't agree or the fighter you didn't like didn't win, all of a sudden it's got to be robbery. There isn't that many robberies, and I know people are going to say, Joey, you said robbery when Sean O'Malley beat Piotr Jan. That was a robbery. You said robbery when Paddy Pimblett beat Jared Gordon. That was a robbery, okay? There's been a couple robberies. Every single Saturday, every single pay-per-view, we got, robbery. And in the main event, And I already broke this down in my full card post-fight. You can go check this out where I really went in depth to the fight because I'm not going to break down the fight here all that much. You have people thinking one elbow wins an entire round where the other guy pretty much dominated that round just because blood trickles out. This is Dominic Cruz scoring criteria at its best, and it's done irreparable harm to the MMA community. Blood does not always equal damage exclusively. That's not how it works. There can be concussive damage, impactful damage. There can be leg kick damage. There can be body damage. If I can get through to just 2 people who watch this video, damage does not just mean visual damage. It does not just mean visual damage. Stop after every fight card. Damage, 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 damage-based scoring, damage, 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 okay? Scoring fights are a lot more nuanced than that. And for people to go out there and say, well, if you slow this down and you watch this in slow, you do realize that's not how fights are scored, okay? That's not how fights are scored. I scored the fight for Pantoja. I think he clearly won the fight. I went back and rewatched it, and I thought he clearly won the fight. 3-2 bare minimum. I think you could make 4-1. You could make the case for 4-1. And I know people are going to cry about this and say, damage, Joey, damage. Leg kick damage from Pantoja. Body shot damage from Pantoja. Clubbing shots upstairs from Pantoja. And for whatever reason, people think Steve Erceg won because he landed a couple really good elbows. That's basically an oversimplification of why people think Erceg won. And let me just say this, and I tweeted this out earlier. Go follow me on Twitter at MMAJoeyC. People who thought Alexandre Pantoja won. Steve Erceg's corner, the commentators, everyone in the media for the most part, and, people who thought Steve Erceg won. People who picked Steve Erceg and people who bet on Steve Erceg. That's essentially what you got. Okay, we have to stop this constant crying about robbery every single time. The fighter that you picked, the fighter that you bet on didn't win. We have to stop acting like it's so simple in terms of damage. Oh, well, there's one elbow and blood trickled out. Just because Steve Erceg landed an elbow in the 3rd round that cut open Pantoja, that doesn't mean you take the Dominic Cruz scoring criteria and go back and rescore rounds 1 and 2 for Erceg because he landed a cut in round 3. That's not how this works. There can be meaningful damage that is not visual. If it's only visual damage, essentially any fighter with scar tissue is just going to lose every decision from here on out. And I'm so tired of this, man. I'm really so tired of it. I almost thought about making a dedicated video, but I figured I'd just talk about it here. The reasons people think Steve Erceg won, and I don't think it's the majority. I think it's a decent amount. You underestimated him going into this fight, so now he surprised you and had a competitive fight. And on top of that, it's because Pantoja, his body language always looks like shit in every fight. It always looks like shit. It looks like shit it looks like shit against Rival. It looked like shit against Moreno. He has a weird body language where he almost looks completely exhausted after the 1st round every single time. And basically, people underestimating Steve Erceg and him going out there and overperforming. And then also people who bet on him, really wanting him to win. It's like robbery, 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 damage, damage, damage. Just because there's blood, that means this guy's damaged more. Even though Pantoja was doing quite a bit of damage to the body, to the leg. Look up the scoring criteria. I'm not here to be one of those snobs and say, oh, I know the scoring criteria better than you and damage, damage, damage. No, I'm just saying, look, guys, visual damage is not the only damage that is assessed by the judging. These judges do not have access to slow-mo replays and not going by and watching frame by frame, okay? And also, grappling does mean something. When the round is close to even, like round 5 was close to even in terms of damage and strikes, effective grappling can be assessed in the judging criteria. So, in that case, Pantoja takes round 5. So, stop crying robbery every single fight. Stop screaming damage-based scoring over and over and over again to the point they may end up changing the rules because people keep screaming about it, but probably not. They don't really care what people scream about. Alexandre Pantoja won. Go check out my full card post-fight recap if you want to hear more about that. But let me know what you guys think of my takeaways. Did I miss anything that should have been on the list? Is there anything, massive that should have been on the list? Let me know down in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.